There are certain paradoxes in our world that behave like a hairline fracture running through a monolithic wall. At first glance, they seem insignificant, perhaps just a trick of the lighting. But when you press against them, they force you to question the structural integrity of the entire building. Our entire understanding of history is built on a foundation of supposedly unshakable truths: the undisputed greatness of the Enlightenment, the unrivaled genius of past architects, and the continuous linear path of human progress. We stand in awe before the luxurious palaces of Europe and Russia, monuments where gold dazzles the eye and the architecture itself seems to defy gravity. The Hermitage, Versailles, Peterhof. These names are not merely locations. They are synonymous with absolute power and cultural splendor. They are the pinnacles of aesthetic achievement. But one only needs to look closer at the details to find the cracks. Behind the gilded facade and the marble columns, something absurd emerges. We encounter something so illogical, so fundamentally broken, that the rational mind initially refuses to accept it. In these masterpieces, where every line of the facade was calculated to the millimeter, and the acoustics of every hall were meticulously planned for the perfect resonance of a violin, the architects allegedly missed one tiny, yet absolutely vital detail. The official history, the version taught in every school textbook and recounted by guides on every walking tour, asks us to blindly accept a version of the world that is riddled with glaring contradictions. We are shown majestic images of enlightened monarchs and a brilliant aristocracy, figures draped in the finest silks and topped with elaborate powdered wigs. We see them as the apex of sophistication. But in the same breath, we are told disturbing facts about the daily customs of the era. Historians sheepishly mumble, often trying to change the subject, that European nobility was not known for its cleanliness. They admit that these refined figures relieved themselves behind heavy velvet curtains in the grand hallways, or used portable chamber pots, the foul contents of which were then simply splashed out of the windows onto the cobblestones below. We are asked to believe a staggering impossibility, that the greatest minds of that time, minds capable of calculating the structural load of multi-ton domes and designing flying buttresses, simply could not figure out how to lay a ceramic pipe to carry away human waste. They could chart the stars, yet they could not dig a sewage trench. This argument crumbles upon its very first contact with physical reality. To understand why this is impossible, we need only look at the hydraulic systems of these very same palace complexes. Peterhof and Versailles are not just decorative gardens with pretty fountains. They are hymns to engineering. They are symphonies written in water. These sites feature incredibly complex systems of communicating vessels, vast reservoirs, and intricate sluices that carry water from dozens of kilometers away. This water travels under immense pressure, channeled to create a spectacle of jets soaring into the sky, defying nature itself. And all of this was achieved without a single electric pump, powered exclusively by the force of gravity and brilliant mathematical calculations. The engineers of that era possessed a knowledge of hydraulics that could stump many modern graduates of top technical universities. They controlled the wild element of water with surgical precision, bending it to their will. And this is where the main question arises, the question that shatters our entire worldview. How could a civilization capable of building the Samson fountain, where a massive column of water shoots 20 meters high into the air, forget about the most basic form of plumbing? If you can create such a marvel of engineering, manipulating fluid dynamics to create art, then designing a simple slope in a stone floor and running a pipe to a cesspool outside the palace walls is a task for a kindergartner. It is elementary physics. This isn't just an oddity or a quirky historical fact. It is a technological absurdity. Such a glaring discrepancy cannot be a mere accident or a cultural quirk. It is a direct indication that we are dealing with a lie. The official explanations provided by academia are just a clumsy screen, a distraction designed to hide an inconvenient, foul-smelling truth. This seemingly minor domestic question, the total absence of toilets, is the very thread that, when pulled, can unravel the entire fabric of history as we know it. We are beginning an investigation where this paradox will become the key to unlocking a global mystery that changes everything we thought we knew. To fully grasp the depth of this contradiction, one must immerse themselves in the magnificent engineering genius frozen in the fountain complexes of Peterhof and Versailles. These are not mere decorative elements of the landscape. They are a triumph of hydraulic science. Official science claims that the fountain system of Peterhof, ostensibly created in the 18th century, operates solely on the force of gravity. We are told that water from the Ropsha Heights, located dozens of kilometers away from the palace, is collected in a complex network of ponds and channels. From there, it rushes downward toward the sea through a system of cast iron pipes. The difference in elevation creates a colossal build-up of pressure, capable of launching multi-ton columns of water more than 20 meters high. This narrative sounds beautiful and simple in theory. However, in practice, implementing such a project requires more than just digging ditches with surf labor. It demands a perfect mathematical calculation of the gradient, precise down to the millimeter over a distance of many kilometers. The slightest error in design, a variance of a fraction of a degree, would cause the water to either stagnate in the pipes or build up too much pressure and burst the system in low-lying areas. And here we encounter the first artifact that defies the general historical narrative, the quality of the pipes themselves. During modern restorations of these old systems, engineers are finding fragments of pipes cast from an iron of such superior quality that it surpasses many modern equivalents. These are pipelines with perfectly smooth interiors, reducing friction to a minimum, capable of withstanding immense hydrostatic pressure for decades, even centuries. They feature joints whose precision and reliability rival modern flange technologies. The question inevitably arises: how could a civilization that, according to historians, could not manage the mass production of ceramic toilets and sewage drains for the imperial palace, be capable of casting kilometers of such high-strength, complex pipes? That is like finding the jet engine of a supersonic aircraft installed in a horse-drawn cart. The two levels of technology do not belong in the same timeline. Now, let's move from the spacious parks, bathed in the mist of pristine water, into the palaces themselves, into their glittering halls of mirrors and grand ballrooms. The picture that history paints for us stands in stark, horrifying contrast to this external splendor. We are assured that within these walls, where the fates of empires were decided and treaties were signed, a choking stench reigned supreme. The air was not fresh, it was thick with the heavy scent of perfume. And this perfume, it is claimed, was invented not for the art of seduction, but out of desperate necessity, to mask the nauseating smell of unwashed bodies and human waste that had seeped into the velvet drapes, the expensive tapestries and the wood of the floors. Kings, empresses, dukes, and ladies in waiting, dressed in the finest silks and delicate lace, were allegedly forced to squat over chamber pots or find a secluded corner behind a curtain in the middle of a social gathering. This is presented to us as the norm for the time, as some kind of curious cultural peculiarity. But herein lies the main technological oxymoron that breaks all logic of historical development. It is impossible to imagine a society that possesses the knowledge to control the element of water with such surgical precision outdoors, yet lives in absolute domestic filth indoors. Technologies develop as a unified whole. They are interdependent. If a civilization has successfully mastered complex metallurgy and advanced hydraulics to create pressurized fountain systems, then the creation of primitive sanitation, A simple gravity-fed sewer line becomes a secondary, almost elementary task. This is not merely a design flaw or a peculiar cultural misunderstanding. It is proof the fountains and the palaces are systems of different technological levels, systems which fundamentally could not have been created by the same people in the same era. A civilization that engineered the Ferrari engine of fountain systems somehow didn't bother to install it in the cart of domestic comfort, continuing instead to use the most basic animal power, represented by crude chamber pots. This state of affairs contradicts all common sense and the fundamental logic of technological progress. Technology always seeks efficiency. This leads us to a shocking, yet uniquely logical hypothesis, one that turns history on its head. What if those who inherited and used this cart simply didn't know how to start and maintain the complex engine? What if the magnificent hydraulic system was an autonomous, perpetually functioning machine, a pristine artifact inherited by the new masters of the palaces in a ready-to-use, yet completely opaque state? They could admire its operation. They could demonstrate its spectacular power as an undeniable symbol of their new authority. But they possessed neither the knowledge nor the technology, the code, if you will, to interfere with its design. They could not redirect even a small fraction of that colossal, powerful flow of water for basic hygienic needs, because they didn't know the first thing about the system's inner workings. What if the inhabitants of the palaces and their original builders were entirely different civilizations? This hypothesis, which seems fantastical and perhaps even absurd at first glance, takes on a chilling and undeniable logic as soon as we stop looking at the palaces as the creations of their famous inhabitants, the tsars and the kings, and start seeing them instead as inherited, high-tech objects. Imagine for a moment a group of people who, having survived some vast global cataclysm, find an abandoned modern city. They enter towering glass and steel skyscrapers. They see elevators, but they don't understand how the complex machinery works, so they crudely bar the doors and use the cabins as temporary storage closets. They see complex climate control systems and ventilation shafts, but not knowing how to turn on the power, they break up the intricate vents just because they cause a drafting. They find luxurious bathrooms, but the water and sewage systems are completely offline, damaged by the catastrophe, and they don't possess the technical knowledge or the resources to fix them. As a result of this deep technological regression, they begin to relieve themselves in the hallways or in buckets, because that is the only thing that aligns with their current, primitive level of understanding. This is precisely the scenario of primitive use and ignorant appropriation that we observe across the accepted history of the 15th through 18th centuries. It is a classic cargo cult, but on a planetary grand scale. Instead of islanders worshipping straw airplanes, we have the settlement and reuse of stone masterpieces left behind by a previous, far more advanced civilization. The evidence for this theory is woven into the very architectural DNA of these magnificent, repurposed buildings. Let's start with the most basic necessity in northern latitudes: heating. The enormous halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg or Versailles in France, with their towering, cathedral-like ceilings of 5 to 6 meters and gigantic windows that are colossal sources of instantaneous heat loss, are equipped with only small, almost decorative fireplaces. Anyone familiar with basic thermodynamics understands that it is an absolute physical impossibility to effectively heat such a massive hangar with a small, aesthetic fireplace in the harsh grip of a northern winter, when temperatures plummet to 30 degrees below 0 Celsius outside. Even if the occupants burned entire groves of trees in these shallow grates, all the heat would immediately rise to the distant ceiling, leaving the human-level space below freezing, forcing everyone to cluster together. Official history tells us, quite matter-of-factly, that monarchs and courtiers wore heavy fur coats right inside the palace walls. But why would a powerful civilization build its most important residence in a northern, unforgiving climate with the thermal insulation of a summer pavilion? It is not just illogical, it is architecturally suicidal. Unless, of course, these buildings were originally designed for completely different, highly efficient climate control technologies. Theories suggest that complex, hidden systems of sophisticated air ducts were originally laid within the thick, immense walls of these palaces, heating the vast rooms from the inside using some form of clean, decentralized energy. The fireplaces we see today, with their black soot and crude chimneys, are nothing more than clumsy insertions made by later settlers who did not understand how to activate the main, original, powerful system. They simply punched chimney holes where none had existed, damaging and destroying the original engineering just to avoid freezing to death in the abandoned Goliath's homes. But the most obvious and disturbing evidence concerns the scale itself. The architecture of these palaces is clearly not designed for a person of average modern height. Look closely. There are gigantic, massive doors reaching 4 to 5 meters in height, with the door handles located at face level or even higher on the frame. To open such a heavy, oversized door, an average modern person needs to exert considerable effort and literally reach up with their full arm. The steps on the grand staircases are often disproportionately high and wide, making them incredibly awkward to climb. One doesn't walk up these stairs, one practically scrambles up them. Mirrors in the halls hang so ridiculously high that it is impossible to see oneself without standing on a ladder or viewing the reflection from across the massive room. All of this, from the general proportions of the echoing halls, in which a person feels utterly dwarfed, like an insect, to the small, subtle details of the fittings, indicates one cohesive truth. These spaces were created for beings of a much greater stature. All these details, the inability to manage simple utilities, despite the presence of highly complex external engineering, the crude and desperate attempts to solve the heating problem, and most importantly, the inhuman scale of the buildings form a single, terrifyingly consistent picture. The palaces were not built for the short, powdered kings and emperors whose names we know from textbooks. We are Lilliputians who have settled and adapted to the abandoned homes of Gullivers. We admire the beautiful stucco work, yet we cannot replicate the composition of the mortar that has held for centuries. We look at the perfectly fitted granite blocks on the exterior, and we cannot explain what tools were used to process them with such uncanny precision. We simply arrived at ready-made, enormous stone mansions, cleaned them of dirt and debris, and began to live in them, adapting them to our primitive needs as best we could. But if this foundational premise is true, then two more, even more frightening questions inevitably arise, demanding an answer. Where did the former, true owners of these palaces go, and why were their majestic, perfect homes abandoned and empty, ready to receive new, smaller tenants? The answer to this profound mystery may lie not in the heavens, not in ancient texts, but literally right beneath our feet. The evidence of this civilizational replacement is not confined to the luxurious interiors of palaces. It is literally on the surface, or rather, just beneath it, visible to any unbiased observer who takes the time to look. One only needs to walk down a street in the historic center of any old city in the world, be it St. Petersburg, Paris, Rome, or Moscow, and look carefully at the bases of the old buildings. We are confronted with a disturbing and widespread anomaly. The windows of the first floors are not just low, they are halfway or even completely sunken into the ground. We frequently see only the upper part of a beautifully decorated window arch peeking out from under the modern asphalt, while the sturdy stone windowsill is meters deep, beneath the feet of passers-by. Often one can also find grand entrances or doors that now lead into a solid, impenetrable wall of earth. This is a question frozen in stone, a massive physical anomaly to which official history gives a completely unconvincing and frankly embarrassing answer. Historians explain this global phenomenon with the concept of the so-called cultural layer. The theory states that over centuries, people brought so much dirt and debris on their shoes, and street cleaners did such a poor job of management that the ground level naturally rose by 3 and sometimes even 5 meters. Consider for a moment the sheer, paralyzing absurdity of this claim. 5 meters is the approximate height of a 1.5-story building. If we believe the official version, our ancestors voluntarily lived in a planetary-scale pigsty, a state of perpetual filth, where for centuries they did not remove trash waste and accumulated debris but simply compacted it, constantly building new roads and pathways on top of the old ones. But this theory crumbles at the slightest contact with simple logic and basic facts. Who in their right mind, in an era renowned for its architectural precision, would design a magnificent building with full-sized, beautifully decorated windows and grand, imposing entrances on the first floor, knowing that in just 100 years they would be swallowed by the earth? Who would create expensive stonework, finely crafted arches, and decorative elements there? Elements which no one would ever see again. When archaeologists or modern construction workers excavate the foundations of these buildings, they discover that these so-called basements are, in fact, complete first floors. They are fully functional levels, complete with windows, doors, and often even traces of external features like balconies or small terraces, everything a ground floor should have. The answer, then, is obvious, and it is both simple and terrifying in its implications. These floors were not built underground. They ended up there as a result of a massive, sudden catastrophe. Researchers of alternative history call this phenomenon the mud flood, a global cataclysm that in the not-so-distant past buried cities across the entire planet under a multimeter layer of dense clay, sand, and fine soil. Some overwhelming event occurred. Perhaps a massive comet impact, a shifting of the poles, or a series of massive volcanic eruptions, which threw billions of tons of liquefied rock and sediment into the atmosphere, which subsequently dropped onto the surface, burying entire existing metropolises. It is this hypothesis that provides a comprehensive and the only logically consistent answer to the mystery of the missing toilets, with which our investigation began. Imagine a high-tech building where all the vital utilities, the precise water supply, the complex sanitation, the sophisticated heating, ventilation, and even the power systems are located, as they should be, on the lower technical floors. And then, in one terrifying moment, these floors are buried under a thick, dense, unyielding layer of compacted clay. The few survivors, or the newly arrived, technologically primitive settlers, occupy the still intact upper floors. They have neither the knowledge, the equipment, nor the resources to excavate the entire city to a depth of several meters. They simply level the new ground surface to what used to be the second or third floor, turn the old windows into new entry doors, and start a new life. But all the original, high technology was left down below, permanently inaccessible. The complex pipes are hopelessly broken or instantly clogged with dense, compacted soil. What are they left to do? Exactly use chamber pots and pour the waste out of the windows directly onto the so-called cultural layer, which in reality is not evidence of historic uncleanliness, but a giant, silent tombstone over a lost, far more advanced civilization. Thus, a planetary catastrophe perfectly explains the technological gap and the strange, inexplicable domestic habits. It explains why geniuses who built massive fountains didn't use sanitation, because the ones who were forced to use chamber pots were simply not the ones who built the high-tech systems. But in solving one great mystery, this discovery gives rise to the next, even more terrifying one. If cities around the world were buried under a multimeter layer of soil and sediment, what happened to their billions of inhabitants? To those very Gullivers who built them? Where did they disappear? And the main question, the most crucial question of all, if they disappeared, then where exactly did we come from? The answer to this question can be found in a language that cannot be easily forged or manipulated, the language of mathematics, statistics, and irrefutable documentary evidence. If we look at any standard graph of world population growth, we see a strange and deeply inexplicable anomaly. For thousands of documented years, the curve of human population is a nearly flat, barely fluctuating line indicating slow, steady growth. Then, suddenly, around the mid-19th century, there is a vertical, almost unnatural spike, an exponential, sudden explosion of human numbers. Official science explains this demographic explosion by citing advances in modern medicine and the Industrial Revolution. But this version doesn't stand up to scrutiny when compared with other photographic and statistical facts from that exact era. We need only look at the earliest surviving photographs, the stunning daguerreotypes from the 1840s and 1850s. Examine images of Paris, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Rome, London. What do these images have in common? A total, deafening, and absolute emptiness. Majestic, fully constructed cities, complete with paved streets, elaborate embankments, and complex, finished architecture stand completely empty. We are told the standard explanation goes that this is due to the technical limitations of early cameras, the so-called long exposure time, which supposedly prevented moving objects, people, from being captured on the sensitive plate. But this is a ludicrous, manipulative lie designed for those completely ignorant of basic physics and early photographic technology. If the exposure was so long that people in motion completely disappeared from the frame, then why are the shadows of buildings and stationary trees sharp and clear? Why is the water in canals and rivers frozen in time and not a misty blur? Why are flags on the tops of buildings hanging completely still and not smeared by the wind? And most importantly, where are the parked carriages, the resting horses, and the market stalls that stay in one place for hours? They are simply not there. The cities stand like giant, flawless, and eerie movie sets, awaiting their actors. And here we come to the most shocking demographic fact, which historians try to obscure and soften with the innocuous term, urbanization. In the 19th century, millions upon millions of orphans suddenly appear all over the world, as if generated from nowhere. This is no exaggeration. In Russia, enormous founding homes are built, designed for the care and processing of tens of thousands of children. In London and Paris, orphanages are overflowing beyond capacity. In the United States, a whole program known as the Orphan Trains is launched, which for decades transports hundreds of thousands of parentless children from the crowded East Coast to the Wild West, where they are given to farmers as free labor. Where did these sudden legions of parentless children come from? Where were their fathers and mothers? Did they all simultaneously fall victim to some bizarre, selective epidemic that miraculously spared only their young offspring? Logic and common sense refuse to accept such a convenient, flimsy explanation. There is a terrifying but chillingly consistent theory that ties all these facts together: the buried cities, the empty streets in early photographs, the sudden, unnatural demographic explosion, and the millions of unmoored orphans. The theory is this: we are a civilization of orphans. We are the descendants of those who were artificially settled into empty, waiting cities after a global catastrophe and subsequent cleanup operation. Perhaps we were, in effect, raised in some kind of vast global incubators. Those very same foundling homes, those overflowing orphanages served as the human production line. We were given new, simple, easily traceable surnames like Ivanov, Petrov, Smith, or Johnson. We were provided with a simple, linear and easily understandable history, completely devoid of deep context. and then sent to inhabit the ruins of a great civilization, which were subsequently presented to us as our own contemporary achievements. This process is precisely why, for the vast majority of people on the planet, ancestral memory is severed somewhere in the mid to late 19th century. Ask yourself this question. How many of you can reliably name your great-great-great-grandfather? Furthermore, how many can pinpoint precisely where he lived, what his profession was, and where his final resting place is? For 90% of people, beyond that narrow chronological point lies an impenetrable fog. The family tree is as if it was systematically chopped off at the very root. Such a global reset of human civilization explains everything: the hauntingly empty cities that were just beginning to be populated, the demographic explosion that was not natural growth, but the process of this forced settlement, and the sudden, documented appearance of millions of children with no discernible past. We arrived in a ready-made but devastated land. But if such a grand and cynical operation to replace a civilization truly took place, then its organizers, the new masters of the world, must have made colossal, sustained efforts to comprehensively hide or destroy all lingering traces of the previous, much more advanced civilization. How exactly did they hide the evidence of what was lost? The destruction of the previous civilization's heritage was methodical, carried out using the two most effective tools available to any historian or regime seeking control: fire and deception. Fire became the most potent eraser in the hands of history's falsifiers. With frightening, suspicious regularity, a wave of so-called Great Fires swept across the world in the 19th century. The Great Fire of Moscow in 1812, the devastating Great Fires of Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco, not to mention major conflagrations in Hamburg and London. The list goes on for dozens of major cities worldwide. Official history blames it all on simple, unfortunate accidents. Wooden buildings, a fallen candle, a cow kicking over a kerosene lamp. But these explanations seem childish and offensively naive when we look at the photographic evidence of the aftermath. Cities built primarily of stone, brick, and granite were burned to the ground as if they had been doused with napalm from the sky or struck by a massive thermal weapon. Stone doesn't burn, but in pictures from that time, we see granite blocks and marble columns that have literally crumbled to sand and dust. This suggests exposure to temperatures thousands of degrees, unattainable in any normal, localized fire. This was not an accident, this was a deliberate cleanup operation. It wasn't just houses being destroyed, it was evidence. And most importantly, with particular thoroughness and inevitability, these fires consumed archives, libraries, city halls, and patent offices. The flames specifically devoured census records, old maps, blueprints, and technical documentation. All the memory that could have told the truth about the real timeline and the true technological level of the past. This process of selective destruction has continued for centuries, from the legendary Library of Alexandria to the mysterious Indian Library in Moscow. Every time too many inconvenient artifacts accumulated in one place, a spontaneous, unexplained fire would conveniently occur. We were systematically left with only carefully filtered and heavily rewritten textbooks, which told us how illiterate peasants with primitive chisels and hammers created architectural masterpieces that we cannot accurately replicate today, even with the aid of lasers and computer modeling. The second, even more cynical method of concealing the truth was the grand spectacle of the world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Brussels. The official version claims that for these temporary events, gigantic exhibition pavilions in the classical or neoclassical style were miraculously erected in just 1 or 2 years from temporary materials. We are told that entire, sprawling cities, complete with massive domes, colonnades, artificial canals, complex sculptural compositions, and full electric illumination, were built from staff a flimsy mixture of plaster, straw, and horsehair, and after the exhibition, which lasted a mere few months, all this architectural splendor was ruthlessly demolished and dismantled. Only someone who has never truly looked at the photos of these temporary structures could believe this narrative. These were monumental buildings, often surpassing the architectural quality, complexity and sheer scale of Capitol buildings or St. Peter's Basilica. The idea that such architecturally complex objects could be created from plaster in a year by manual labor and then simply destroyed is a mockery of common sense and the fundamental laws of physics and economics. The terrible truth is that these cities weren't built for the fairs. They were excavated. They were miraculously preserved districts, perhaps not completely buried by the cultural layer of that very ancient, high-technology civilization of Gullivers. They were professionally restored, meticulously cleaned up, and connected to electricity, which was perhaps part of their original, enduring infrastructure. They were then shown to an astonished, awestruck public. But this incredible heritage was presented not as a legacy of the past, but as an incredible achievement of the modern industrial era, a fantastical architectural dream. People were shown working. Complex technology, moving sidewalks, wireless energy transmission systems, and sophisticated acoustic systems. But it was all served up as a temporary attraction. And then, immediately after the closing ceremony, these complexes were ruthlessly blown up, dismantled, and leveled. Why? Because they were too perfect. They revealed a level of technology that could not be explained by the current dominant paradigm of the steam engine and manual labor. They were a living, stone reproach to the new, primitive reality that the new rulers were trying to establish. The new elites who seized power after the global cataclysm needed to achieve one critical goal: to erase the very memory of a golden age, a time when things were fundamentally better, easier, and more technologically advanced. They achieved this by turning that ancient splendor into a fleeting, temporary fairground spectacle, and then physically destroying it all. They were gripped by the fear that people, upon seeing this undeniable evidence, would start asking inconvenient fundamental questions. Questions like, if we can supposedly build this level of architectural perfection from mere plaster in a single year, why do we now live in dirty, cramped, temporary brick boxes? So, the spectacular palaces of the world's fairs were ruthlessly dynamited, their immense rubble often dumped into nearby bodies of water to create new, deceptive embankments and false waterfronts, and history was definitively rewritten, brick by painful brick. This was the final, devastating stage of the cleanup, the complete destruction of the most obvious, the most beautiful, and the most perfect material evidence of the god civilization. They erased our deep memory, destroyed the physical, tangible evidence, and constructed a new, simple history convenient for controlling and managing us. They convinced us, with carefully curated textbooks and museum displays, that we are slowly and painfully moving along a continuous path of progress, from a primitive wooden splinter to an advanced LED screen. And now, knowing all this, knowing about the buried first floors of entire cities, the hauntingly empty streets in the oldest photographs, the inexplicable millions of orphans, the suspiciously timed great fires, and the disposable, excavated cities of the world's fairs, how should we look at the world immediately around us? Our investigation, which began with the simple and almost comical question about the singular lack of toilets in the most luxurious palaces, has led us down a frightening, undeniable chain of discoveries. Each link in this chain has shattered a piece of our familiar worldview. We started with the stark contrast between the brilliant hydro-engineering of the monumental fountains and the domestic squalor of their inhabitants, and we concluded that the builders and the eventual residents of the palaces could not have been the same people. Then, by analyzing the inhuman scale of the architecture itself, The gigantic doors, the awkward climbing steps, the sheer physical impossibility of heating those vast spaces, we realized that these buildings were simply not made for us. We are merely settlers, Lilliputians in the abandoned land of Gullivers, who have adapted foreign, oversized houses for our own diminished needs. The search for an answer to where the true owners went led us to the evidence of a global cataclysm, the first floors of cities, buried under meters of earth all over the world. This catastrophic event explained the sudden lack of access to the original, crucial utilities and high-level technologies. But the catastrophe created a new, deeper mystery. If the previous population perished or vanished, then where exactly did we come from? The answer turned out to be the most shocking discovery of all. The empty cities in the first photographs, the sudden, anomalous demographic explosion, and the millions of institutionalized orphans in the 19th century all formed a single, horrifying picture of a global reset of humanity. We are the descendants of an artificially raised and settled generation, a civilization with severed ancestral roots and a systematically erased memory. And finally, we saw how methodically and ruthlessly the last, perfect pieces of evidence were destroyed, the great fires that incinerated all records, and the grand, public spectacle of the world's fairs, where the excavated cities of the ancients were first displayed as a marvel of modernity and then meticulously wiped from the face of the earth. This entire consistent chain of evidence leads to a single, all-encompassing, and terrifying conclusion. The history we know is a fabrication. We are living in a world built entirely on the massive, forgotten ruins of a far more advanced civilization. But we have been convinced that these ruins represent the pinnacle of our own, hard-won achievements. Our path is presented to us as continuous, upward progress. But in reality it is a carefully managed degradation. They gave us complex and fascinating gadgets, the shiny, distracting digital screens of today, to consume our attention and divert our focus. But in return they took away the core, fundamental technologies of free energy, longevity, and true harmony with nature that our predecessors likely possessed. They proudly gave us central, messy plumbing, but deprived us of the eternal, perfect architecture capable of standing for millennia. They convinced us that we are the pinnacle of creation, slowly crawling out of the caves, when in fact we may be merely the feral, amnesic descendants of gods who have completely forgotten their origins. We are a generation with collective amnesia. We wander among giant megalithic structures, perfectly fitted granite embankments and mysterious star forts, not understanding their true, technical purpose. We admire them as works of primitive art, when they might be the surviving components of a massive, global energy or navigation system. We use a microscope to hammer nails and call it progress. We live in the graveyard of a great civilization, but we've been told it's a beautiful garden we grew entirely ourselves. And the most terrifying part is that the process of replacement and memory eraser is not over. It is happening right now before our very eyes, continuing in the institutions and narratives that shape our lives. But the stones still cry out the truth. The millions of tons of perfectly cut granite and the perfectly fitted polygonal masonry found across the world cannot be faked or convincingly attributed to the labor of slaves with simple copper chisels. They are the silent, enduring witnesses that we are not the first ones here. And perhaps our most important task in this confusing world is not to invent a new future, but to stop, look down at the stone beneath our feet, and try to remember and understand the old world.